The fluorescent lights
I'll
of the
give you
Ashford
10
Grand
billion
Hotel
if you marry
flickered
me right
once
now.
twice,
I
then
can't.
steadied
Please, I need
themselves
to
against
think.
the Chicago night. 47 floors above the sleeping city, Vivian Ashford sat alone in the presidential suite, her bare feet tucked beneath her on a white leather sofa that cost more than most people earned in a year. She was 24 years old. She owned 17 luxury hotels across 3 continents, and in exactly 6 weeks she would lose everything. The document in her hands trembled slightly as she read it for what must have been the 100th time. The paper had grown soft at the edges from repeated handling, the legal language now burned into her memory like a brand. Her father's last will and testament, his final act of control from beyond the grave. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago spread out like a carpet of diamonds against black velvet, the city that her great-grandfather had helped build. The city where her grandfather had opened the first Ashford Hotel in 1942. The city where her father had transformed a single property into an empire worth $18 billion. And now that empire hung by a thread made of one impossible condition. Vivian set down the document and reached for the crystal tumbler on the side table. The whiskey inside was a 50-year-old single malt, a bottle worth more than some cars. She drank it like water these days. Not for the taste, not even for the numbness, but because it was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking when she thought about what was coming. 6 weeks until her 25th birthday. 6 weeks until the deadline her father had set. 6 weeks to find a husband. She laughed at that thought, but it was a hollow sound that echoed off the marble floors and disappeared into the vaulted ceiling. A husband, as if marriage were something you could order from a catalog. As if love were a transaction that could be completed before a legal deadline. But that was exactly how her father had always seen the world. Harrison Ashford had been many things. A visionary businessman, a ruthless negotiator, a man who turned every obstacle into an opportunity and every opponent into a stepping stone. He had built the Ashford hotel chain through sheer force of will, crushing competitors and absorbing smaller properties until his empire stretched from New York to Los Angeles, from London to Dubai. He had also been a terrible father. Vivian closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. The empty seats at school plays, the missed birthdays, the way he would look at her across the dinner table, not with love, but with calculation, as if she were another asset to be managed, another investment to be optimized. And perhaps she was. Perhaps she had always been nothing more than a piece in his grand chess game. The will had made that painfully clear. 6 months ago, Harrison Ashford had collapsed in his office at the age of 63. A massive heart attack, the doctor said. Dead before he hit the floor. Vivian had been in Paris when she got the call overseeing the renovation of the Ashford Grand on the Champs-Élysées. She had flown back immediately, still wearing the same clothes she had put on that morning, her mind numb with shock. The funeral had been a circus. 3,000 people attended, senators and celebrities, titans of industry and heads of state. They had all come to pay their respects to Harrison Ashford, the self-made billionaire who had reshaped the hospitality industry. They had spoken of his vision, his drive, his uncompromising standards. None of them had spoken of his daughter. None of them had noticed the young woman sitting in the front row, her face hidden behind a black veil, her heart breaking in ways she could not explain. And then came the reading of the will. Vivian still remembered the moment when the lawyer's voice had stumbled over the words. The way he had looked up from the document with something like pity in his eyes. The way the board members sitting around the conference table had shifted in their seats, their expressions transforming from bored patience to predatory interest. The conditions of inheritance were simple, brutally simple. Vivian Ashford would receive full control of the Ashford hotel chain and all associated assets upon reaching her 25th birthday. However, this inheritance was contingent upon one requirement. She must be legally married before that date. If she failed to meet this condition, the entire company would be liquidated and sold to a consortium of investors. The Ashford name would disappear. 3 generations of her family's legacy would be erased as if it had never existed. And Preston Whitmore would get exactly what he wanted. Vivian's jaw tightened at the thought of him. Preston Whitmore had served on the Ashford Board of Directors for 15 years. He had been her father's right hand, his most trusted advisor, the man who knew every secret and every skeleton in the company's closets. He was 58 years old with silver hair and cold blue eyes that reminded Vivian of a winter sky just before a blizzard. He had always looked at her with barely concealed contempt, and now he was circling like a vulture waiting for its prey to stop breathing. The consortium he had assembled was ready to pounce the moment Vivian failed to meet her father's deadline. They would tear the company apart, sell off the properties piece by piece, pocket billions in profits, while thousands of employees lost their jobs. Everything her family had built would be gone, and Preston Whitmore would walk away with a fortune, laughing at the memory of the girl who thought she could run with the wolves. Vivian stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. 47 floors below, the streets of Chicago were empty and quiet. It was nearly midnight, that strange hour when one day dies and another struggles to be born. She had tried everything. 5 different law firms had reviewed her father's will. 5 teams of the best estate attorneys in the country had searched for loopholes, technicalities, anything that might invalidate the marriage requirement. They had all reached the same conclusion. The document was airtight. Harrison Ashford had known exactly what he was doing when he drafted those conditions. He had anticipated every possible challenge, closed every potential escape route. Even from beyond the grave, he was still controlling her life, still making decisions for her, still treating her like a child who could not be trusted to choose her own path. And so Vivian had moved to her backup plan. If she could not fight the requirement, she would fulfill it. She had spent the last 3 months searching for a suitable candidate, a man who would agree to a marriage of convenience, sign the necessary papers, maintain the appearance of a legitimate union for 1 year, and then quietly divorce her once the inheritance was secured. It should have been simple. She was young, beautiful, and worth billions. Men should have been lining up at her door, eager for a chance at such an arrangement. But nothing had gone according to plan. The first candidate had been a minor European aristocrat with an impressive title and an empty bank account. He had seemed perfect until Vivian discovered he was already married with a wife and 3 children hidden away in a castle in Bavaria. The second had been a struggling actor recommended by a mutual friend. He had agreed to all her terms, signed a preliminary contract, and then sold the story to a tabloid for $200,000. The scandal had taken weeks to contain. The third had demanded controlling interest in 4 of her hotels as part of the arrangement. When she refused, he had threatened to go public with their negotiations. The fourth had simply disappeared with the $50,000 advance she had given him, never to be heard from again. And the fifth, the most promising of them all, had been revealed as a plant by Preston Whitmore himself. A spy sent to gather information about her desperation, her vulnerability, her willingness to break the rules. 5 failures in 3 months. And now, with only 6 weeks remaining, Vivian was running out of options. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and let out a breath that fogged the surface. Below her, the city continued its quiet rhythms, indifferent to her struggles. People were sleeping, dreaming, living their ordinary lives without the weight of an empire on their shoulders. What would it be like, she wondered, to be ordinary, to work a regular job, pay regular bills, fall in love with someone who wanted her for herself and not for her money? She would never know. She had never been allowed to be ordinary. From the moment of her birth, Vivian had been groomed for greatness. Private schools and private tutors, business classes at 12, board meetings at 16, and MBA from Harvard by 22. Her father had shaped her like clay on a potter's wheel, molding her into the perfect heir, the ideal successor. And then he had added one final condition that she could never meet, because the truth was, Vivian Ashford had never learned how to love. She had learned how to negotiate, how to analyze, how to identify weaknesses and exploit opportunities. She had learned the art of the deal, the science of hospitality, the mathematics of profit margins. But love had never been part of the curriculum. Her mother had died when Vivian was 4 years old, a car accident on a rainy night in Manhattan. Vivian barely remembered her, just fragments of warmth and the scent of jasmine perfume. After that, there had been a succession of nannies and housekeepers, none of whom stayed long enough to form any real attachment. Her father had never remarried. He had never even dated, as far as Vivian knew. Work was his mistress, the company his only true love. And now he expected her to find what he himself had never sought. The irony was not lost on her. Vivian turned away from the window and walked back to the sofa. The legal document lay where she had left it, its words mocking her with their finality. She picked it up one more time, her eyes scanning the familiar paragraphs. There had to be another way. There had to be something she was missing. But even as she searched, she knew the truth. The deadline was real. The consequences were real. And unless she could find a husband in the next 6 weeks, everything would be lost. She set down the document and stood. Perhaps a walk would clear her head. The hallway outside the presidential suite was empty and silent, the carpet soft beneath her bare feet. Vivian had not bothered to put on shoes. Who would see her at this hour? The other suites on this floor were vacant, reserved for VIP guests who rarely materialized. She had the entire penthouse level to herself, or so she thought. The elevator dinged softly and the door slid open to reveal a man pushing a cleaning cart. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with dark hair that showed the first hints of gray at the temples. He was 32 years old, though the weight of his experiences made him seem both older and younger at once. Older in the wisdom behind his eyes. Younger in the quiet hope that still flickered there despite everything life had thrown at him. His blue uniform was crisp and clean, despite hours of work, and his yellow gloves were pulled tight over strong, capable hands. He had the kind of face that spoke of experience of hardship, of lessons learned through pain rather than privilege. He stopped when he saw her, and in that moment something strange happened. Most people who encountered Vivian Ashford had predictable reactions. The men usually looked at her with desire or calculation, seeing either a beautiful woman or a beautiful fortune. The women typically displayed jealousy or deference, sizing up the competition or bowing to the hierarchy of wealth. But this man looked at her with none of those things. His eyes held surprise, certainly. But beneath that, there was something else. Something that took Vivian a moment to identify. Respect. Simple, uncomplicated respect. The kind you might show to any stranger you encountered in a hallway at midnight. He did not know who she was, she realized. Or if he did, he did not care. And that was so unusual, so unprecedented in her experience, that Vivian found herself staring at him like he was some exotic creature she had never encountered before. The man recovered first. He stepped out of the elevator and nodded politely, preparing to move around her and continue his work. His cartwheel squeaked slightly against the marble floor, a homely sound that seemed almost absurd in the opulent surroundings. Vivian should have let him pass. She should have returned to her suite and continued her futile search for solutions. But something stopped her. Later, she would tell herself it was desperation, the act of a drowning woman grasping at any hand that reached toward her. But in that moment, standing in the empty hallway at midnight, Vivian felt something she had not felt in months. Hope. It was irrational. It was absurd. This man was a janitor, for God's sake. A cleaning person who pushed a cart through empty hallways while the rest of the world slept. But he had looked at her without wanting anything. And that made him different from everyone else she had encountered in her 24 years of life. She spoke before she could stop herself. Her voice emerged slightly hoarse from hours of silence, and she had to clear her throat and try again. She asked if he had a moment. The man paused, his hands still resting on the cart handle. His eyes studied her face, taking in the red-rimmed evidence of hours spent staring at legal documents, the tension in her shoulders, the bare feet that spoke of someone who had forgotten to care about appearances. He said he had rounds to finish, but something in her expression must have conveyed the depth of her need, because he did not walk away. Instead, he waited, his posture patient, his attention focused entirely on her. It was that attention, more than anything else, that undid her. When was the last time someone had truly listened to her, not to Vivian Ashford, the heiress, not to Vivian Ashford, the businesswoman, just to Vivian, the woman standing alone in a hallway at midnight, desperate and afraid? She asked if he would come to her suite, just to talk. She promised it was not what it sounded like. She just needed someone to talk to, someone who did not have an agenda. The man should have refused. Every instinct of self-preservation should have told him to politely decline and continue his work. Getting involved with the owner of the hotel chain was a career-ending mistake waiting to happen. But he must have seen something in her eyes, something that spoke louder than caution, because after a long moment he nodded and followed her down the hall. The presidential suite seemed different with someone else in it, smaller somehow, less impressive. The expensive furnishings and priceless artwork faded into the background as Vivian led the man to the sitting area by the windows. She offered him a drink. He declined, gesturing to his uniform. "On the clock," he said. She nodded, understanding. She poured herself another whiskey anyway, needing the liquid courage for what she was about to say. And then she told him everything. About her father, about the will, about the impossible deadline, about the 5 failed candidates and the vultures circling her company, about Preston Whitmore and his consortium, about the thousands of employees who would lose their jobs if she failed, about her fear, her loneliness, her desperation. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, unstoppable and overwhelming. She had not meant to say so much. She had planned to be strategic, careful, calculating. But something about this man's quiet presence stripped away her defenses. He listened without interruption. His face remained still, giving nothing away. And when she finally fell silent, her voice hoarse and her hands trembling around the crystal tumbler, he spoke. His voice was calm and measured the voice of someone who had learned to think before speaking. He said her situation was difficult. He said he understood her fear. He said it was clear she had been fighting alone for too long. And then she made her offer. $10 billion. The number hung in the air between them like a physical object. $10 billion if he would marry her. A business arrangement. Nothing more. He would sign the papers. He would appear in public as her husband. He would maintain the charade for 1 year until her inheritance was secured and she could divorce him without consequences. In exchange, he would receive more money than he could spend in 100 lifetimes. She watched his face as she spoke, searching for the flash of greed that always appeared when people learned what she was worth. The calculation, the hunger, the moment when they stopped seeing her and started seeing only dollar signs. But it never came. Instead, his expression shifted to something else entirely, something she could not identify. He asked her to repeat the number. She did, $10 billion. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said no. Vivian blinked. She was certain she had misheard him. No one said no to $10 billion. No one. But the man was already standing, his hands reaching for the cart he had left by the door. His movements were unhurried, almost gentle, as if he were trying not to startle a wounded animal. He said he was sorry for her situation. He said he hoped she found a solution. But he could not be that solution. Vivian felt something crack inside her. It was not anger, though, that would come later. It was not confusion, though her mind was spinning with questions. It was something deeper. Something that felt almost like relief. Because for the first time in her life, someone had seen her as something other than a means to an end. And that was terrifying. She stood quickly, moving to block his path to the door. She raised her offer. $20 billion. Her voice cracked on the number. $20 billion for 1 year of his life. That was almost $60 million per day. More money than most countries had in their treasuries. Enough to solve every problem he had ever faced or would ever face. The man stopped. He turned to face her. And in his eyes, Vivian saw something that shattered her completely. Pity. Not for himself. For her. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed at odds with his simple uniform and squeaking cart. He told her about his own life. About growing up poor, so poor that he wore the same shoes until his toes broke through the front. About joining the military at 18 because it guaranteed meals and a paycheck. About serving 2 tours overseas and returning home with scars that did not show on the surface. About working jobs that destroyed his body and crushed his spirit. But also about what he had learned, about the importance of dignity, about the value of being true to yourself, about the price of selling your soul. He told her about his wife. She had died 3 years ago. Cancer. They had been married for 5 years. 5 years that he described as the happiest of his life. She had loved him when he had nothing. She had believed in him when no one else did. She had given him a son who was now 7 years old and the most important person in his universe. To marry for money, he said, would betray everything she had meant to him. It would turn their love into a mockery. And no amount of money was worth that price. Vivian felt tears streaming down her face. She had not cried since her father's funeral. She had thought herself beyond tears. But something about this man's words, his simple dignity, his refusal to be bought, broke through every wall she had built around her heart. She asked him what she was supposed to do. If he would not help her. If the lawyers could not help her. If everyone she approached either failed or betrayed her. What was left? His answer was simple. Fight. Not with money, not with schemes and arrangements, but with courage. Challenge the will. Question its validity. refused to accept that her father's control extended beyond the grave. Find lawyers who actually wanted to help her, not just collect fees. Build alliances with people who believed in her vision, not just her checkbook. Be the leader she was meant to be. Vivian stared at him. This man who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans. This man who had just turned down $20 billion. This man who had more wisdom in his quiet words than all the advisors she had ever hired. She asked him his name. Grayson Mercer, he said. She asked how long he had worked at the hotel. 3 years, he said. She asked if he was happy. He smiled at that. It was a small smile touched with sadness. He said happiness was complicated. He said he missed his wife every day. He said he ached for his son who lived with his grandparents because the courts had decided that a man who worked 2 jobs and lived in a studio apartment was not fit to raise a child. But he said he had hope. He was building something, slowly, patiently, brick by brick. A trading career that might one day give him the financial stability he needed to get his son back. A life that would prove to everyone who had ever doubted him that he was more than his circumstances. And he would not compromise that dream, not for any amount of money. Vivian sank back onto the sofa, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The whiskey tumbler slipped from her fingers and landed on the carpet, spilling 50-year-old scotch across the pristine white fibers. She did not notice. She did not care. Because for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to have principles. Real principles. Not the kind you talked about in board meetings or wrote into corporate mission statements. The kind you lived by even when it cost you everything. Grayson moved to leave. He had already stayed far longer than he should have. His rounds were waiting. His job was at stake. But at the door he paused. He turned back to look at her one last time. And he said something that would echo in her mind for days and weeks and months to come. He said that whatever happened with her company, with her inheritance, with her father's impossible demands, she should remember one thing. She was more than what she owned. She was more than what others expected of her. She was a person, a human being, and she deserved to be loved for who she was, not for what she could provide. The door closed behind him, and Vivian Ashford, heiress to an $18 billion empire, sat alone in her penthouse suite and wept. She wept for the mother she had never known. She wept for the father who had never loved her. She wept for the life she had been forced to live and the choices she had never been allowed to make. But most of all, she wept because a stranger with a cleaning cart had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than she had received in 24 years. And she did not know what to do with that. Hours later, as the first gray light of dawn crept over the Chicago skyline, Vivian finally stopped crying. She stood. She walked to the window, and she made a decision. She was done running, done hiding, done trying to buy her way out of problems. Grayson Mercer was right. It was time to fight. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not used in months. A lawyer she had dismissed early in the process because her advice had been too aggressive, too confrontational, too willing to challenge the sacred legacy of Harrison Ashford. The phone rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. Vivian said she was ready, ready to challenge her father's will, ready to go to war. On the other end of the line, the lawyer was suddenly very awake. She said she had been waiting for this call. She said she had some ideas, some approaches that the other firms had been too cautious to try. Vivian smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. For the first time in 6 months, she felt something other than despair. She felt like herself, and somewhere 47 floors below, Grayson Mercer climbed onto a blue Harley-Davidson motorcycle and rode off into the sunrise, not knowing that he had just changed the course of a stranger's life. Not knowing that their paths would cross again. Not knowing that buried in both their pasts was a connection neither of them remembered. A connection that had been waiting 20 years to be rediscovered. The story was only beginning. 3 days after that midnight conversation, Vivian Ashford fired every lawyer on her payroll. All 5 firms, 23 attorneys in total. The calls went out at 7 in the morning, precisely timed to catch each managing partner before their first cup of coffee. Vivian delivered the same message to each of them. Their services were no longer required. Their final invoices would be paid within 30 days. Their access to Ashford Company documents was terminated, effective immediately. The reactions ranged from stunned silence to sputtering outrage. One partner, a silver-haired man who had billed her father over $2 million in the past year, alone actually laughed. He told her she was making a mistake. He told her she needed experienced counsel to navigate the complexities of estate law. He told her that without his firm's guidance, she would lose everything. Vivian thanked him for his concern. Then she hung up. By 8 o'clock, word had spread through the Chicago legal community like wildfire. The Ashford heiress had gone off the deep end. She was firing her advisors. She was acting erratically. She was clearly not equipped to handle the pressure of her situation. By 9 o'clock, Preston Whitmore had heard the news. And by 10 o'clock, he was sitting in an emergency board meeting, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Let her self-destruct, he told the other directors. It would only make their job easier. But Preston Whitmore did not know what Vivian knew. He did not know about the woman she had called at dawn. Margaret Holloway was 62 years old with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every trick in the legal playbook. She had spent 30 years as a prosecutor before transitioning to private practice, specializing in cases that other lawyers deemed unwinnable. Estate challenges, corporate fraud, the kinds of battles that required not just legal knowledge, but the willingness to fight dirty when necessary. Vivian had consulted her briefly 3 months ago during the early days of her search for a way out of her father's will. Margaret had reviewed the documents and delivered a blunt assessment. The will could be challenged. There were procedural irregularities in how it had been witnessed. There were potential claims of undue influence. There was a clause that might violate public policy regarding marriage requirements. But pursuing these challenges would require time, and it would require war, not a polite legal disagreement. Full-scale war against the board of directors, against her father's legacy, against everyone who benefited from maintaining the status quo. At the time, Vivian had not been ready for that. She had been looking for an easier path, a shortcut, a way to satisfy the requirements without burning down everything around her. But Grayson Mercer's words had changed something inside her. Fight, he had said, not with money, with courage. And so Vivian had made her choice. Margaret arrived at the penthouse suite at 11 o'clock that morning, carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived multiple wars. She accepted a cup of black coffee, refused the offer of anything stronger, and spread her documents across the dining table with the precision of a general planning an invasion. The news was better than Vivian had dared to hope. Margaret had spent the past 3 months quietly investigating on her own without authorization, without payment. She had done it because something about Vivian's case had bothered her. Something about the way the other lawyers had dismissed the potential challenges so quickly, so uniformly, so completely. And she had found what she was looking for. The 5 law firms that Vivian had hired over the past months had all reached the same conclusion. The will was airtight, the marriage requirement was unassailable. There was no legal path to challenge Harrison Ashford's final wishes. But they had all been lying. Every single one of them had connections to Preston Whitmore. Business relationships, social ties. In one case, a managing partner whose son was married to Preston's niece. The legal establishment of Chicago had closed ranks around the man who stood to profit most from Vivian's failure, and they had deliberately steered her away from any strategy that might actually succeed. Vivian listened to this revelation in silence. She had suspected betrayal, but the scope of it still took her breath away. Margaret laid out her battle plan. First, they would file a challenge based on the witnessing procedures. The will had been signed in Harrison's hospital room 3 days before his death. The witnesses were 2 members of the Ashford Board of Directors, both of whom stood to benefit financially from the document's provisions. This created a clear conflict of interest that could invalidate the entire document. Second, they would pursue an undue influence claim. Harrison Ashford had been on heavy medication during his final days, including opioids, that could have impaired his judgment. There was evidence that Preston Whitmore had visited him multiple times during this period, always alone and always without other witnesses present. Third and most promising, they would challenge the marriage requirement itself. Several courts had ruled that testamentary conditions requiring marriage violated public policy, particularly when they were designed to control rather than benefit the heir. Harrison's will was a textbook example of posthumous control, an attempt to force his daughter into a life choice she would not otherwise make. Any one of these challenges could succeed. Together they presented a powerful case. But there was a catch. The legal process would take months. perhaps a year or more, and Vivian's deadline was in less than 6 weeks. Margaret was honest about the situation. She could file for an emergency injunction asking the court to suspend the deadline while the challenges were heard, but there was no guarantee the injunction would be granted. Judges were often reluctant to interfere with the wishes of the deceased, even when those wishes were problematic. Vivian might win her legal battles, but she might win them too late. The company could already be sold by the time the courts ruled in her favor. For a long moment, Vivian sat in silence, staring at the documents spread across her dining table. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a physical force. She could play it safe, continue searching for a marriage solution, hope that this time she would find someone trustworthy. Or she could fight, knowing that the fight might cost her everything. She thought about Grayson Mercer, about the quiet dignity in his voice when he had turned down $20 billion, about the way he had looked at her without wanting anything, about his words, "You are more than what you own." Vivian made her decision. File everything she told Margaret. We fight. The next 2 weeks were a blur of legal documents, strategy sessions, and sleepless nights. Margaret filed the challenges on a Tuesday morning, timing the announcement to catch the financial press during their peak news cycle. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Ashford heiress challenges father's will. Billion-dollar battle erupts over hotel empire. Young executive takes on powerful board. The reaction from Preston Whitmore was swift and brutal. He called an emergency press conference and painted Vivian as an ungrateful daughter who was desecrating her father's memory. He questioned her mental stability. He suggested that she was being manipulated by unscrupulous advisors who only wanted to profit from prolonged litigation. The board of directors issued a statement expressing their deep concern for the company's future. Several major investors announced they were reconsidering their positions. The stock price of Ashford's publicly traded subsidiary dropped 8% in a single day. Vivian watched it all unfold from her penthouse suite, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel afraid. She felt alive. The battle was joined. Now she would see what she was truly made of. Through all of this, Vivian continued to think about Grayson Mercer. She had learned his name from the hotel's personnel files accessed through her authority as owner. She had read his employment record, his performance reviews, the commendations from supervisors who praise his work ethic and attention to detail. She had learned that he worked the night shift because it paid a differential of $2 more per hour. She had learned that he had been with the company for 3 years, never missing a single shift, never arriving late, never giving less than his complete effort. She had learned that he was a single father fighting for custody of a 7-year-old son who lived with his maternal grandparents. But she had not sought him out, not because she did not want to, but because she was not sure what she would say. "Thank you for refusing my money. Thank you for treating me like a human being. Thank you for showing me that there are still people in the world who cannot be bought." The words seemed inadequate, and so she had waited. Until the Thursday night when Dorothy Webb, the head of housekeeping, mentioned that Vivian had specifically requested Grayson for the penthouse floor that week. Vivian had made no such request, but she did not correct the misunderstanding. And so at 11:47 that night, she found herself standing in the hallway outside her suite, waiting for the elevator to arrive. The doors opened, and there he was. Grayson Mercer looked exactly as she remembered him. The same blue uniform, the same yellow gloves, the same quiet strength in his posture, the same eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facades. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vivian found her voice. She said she wanted to thank him for what he had said the other night, for refusing her offer, for being honest with her when everyone else had been lying. Grayson listened without expression. When she finished, he nodded slowly. He said he had heard about her legal challenges. He said he was glad she had decided to fight. He said he hoped she won. There was no calculation in his words, no attempt to leverage their connection, no hint that he expected anything in return for his previous kindness. He was simply wishing her well, like any decent person would. Vivian felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back. She asked if he would like some coffee, not as a proposition, not as part of any scheme, just coffee, just conversation, just two people talking in the middle of the night. Grayson hesitated. Every professional instinct was clearly telling him to decline, but something else won out. He said yes. They sat in the same chairs as before by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out below them like a universe of possibilities. Vivienne made espresso with her own hands, a skill she had learned years ago during a summer in Italy, one of the few genuine pleasures her controlled life had allowed. And they talked, not about money, not about legal battles, not about the impossible situations they both faced. They talked about music. Grayson told her about his love for the blues, about growing up listening to his father's record collection, about the way the music had gotten him through the darkest nights after his wife's death, when the grief was so heavy he could barely breathe. Vivienne confessed that she had been forced to study classical piano as a child, that her father had insisted on 4 hours of practice every day, that she had once loved music, but years of compulsion had turned it into a source of anxiety rather than joy. Grayson said that was a tragedy. Music should set you free, he said, not chain you down. They talked about books. Vivienne mentioned that her favorite was The Alchemist. She had read it in college, hidden between the pages of a business textbook so her father would not see. The story of following your personal legend, of having the courage to pursue your dreams even when the world tells you to be practical, had spoken to something deep inside her, something she had buried for years. Grayson said his favorite was Man's Search for Meaning. He had read it in a shelter during those terrible months after his wife's death, when he had lost everything. The book had taught him that even in the worst circumstances, you could choose your attitude. You could find purpose. You could survive. They talked about dreams. Grayson told her about his plan to become a professional trader, about the evaluation he had passed with BlackRock Capital, about the $100,000 he would soon be managing with the potential to scale to millions if he performed well. Vivienne asked if that was what he truly wanted. Grayson thought about it. He said it was part of what he wanted, but his real dream was simpler. He wanted to open a motorcycle restoration shop, a place where he could work with his hands, teaching young people the value of craftsmanship, showing them that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of. And more than anything, he wanted to get his son back. His voice broke slightly when he said this. Liam, he said. His son's name was Liam, 7 years old. The boy looked just like his mother. Same eyes, same smile, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking hard about something. Vivienne listened to him talk about his son, and she felt something shift inside her. This man had nothing. By her standards, by the standards of the world she inhabited, Grayson Mercer was poor beyond measure. But he was rich in ways she had never understood. He had love, real love, the kind that transcended circumstances, the kind that made $20 billion look like pocket change. She asked him why he kept fighting, when everything was stacked against him, when the courts had taken his son, when he was working 2 jobs just to stay afloat. Why did he not give up? Grayson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Vivienne would remember for the rest of her life. He said that giving up was easy. Anyone could give up. But fighting even when you were losing, even when the odds were impossible, even when everyone told you it was hopeless, that was what separated the people who eventually won from the people who spent their lives wondering what might have been. He said he owed it to his wife, to his son, to himself, to keep fighting until he had nothing left, and even then to find something more. Vivienne realized she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. She did not try to hide them. She did not apologize. She just let them fall. Because for the first time in her life, she understood what courage really looked like. It was not boardroom battles. It was not legal strategies. It was not the accumulation of wealth or power. It was a man in a janitor's uniform pushing a cleaning cart through empty hallways, refusing to surrender his dignity, no matter how hard the world tried to take it from him. They talked until nearly 5 in the morning. When Grayson finally stood to leave, Vivienne felt a strange reluctance to let him go. Not romantic, not yet. Something deeper. The recognition of a kindred spirit. Someone who understood what it meant to fight alone. She asked if they could do this again. Next week. Same time. Just talking. Nothing more. Grayson looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Same time next week. As he pushed his cart toward the elevator, Vivienne watched him go, and she realized that she had just made her first real friend in 24 years. The following week brought an escalation on every front. Margaret filed for the emergency injunction, and the court scheduled a hearing for the following month. Preston Whitmore responded by accelerating his plans to sell the company, pushing the board to approve a preliminary agreement with his consortium before the legal challenges could be resolved. Vivian found herself working 20-hour days shuttling between meetings with lawyers, bankers, and the few board members who had not yet declared their loyalty to Preston. But every Thursday night, she kept her appointment with Grayson. They would sit in her suite drinking coffee and talking about everything except the battles they were both fighting: music and books, dreams and memories. The small details of life that seemed so insignificant but were really all that mattered. Vivian learned that Grayson's wife had been named Sarah, that they had met at a veterans support group after he returned from 2 tours overseas, that she had seen past his rough exterior to the gentle soul underneath, that she had believed in him when he did not believe in himself, that her death had shattered him in ways he was still learning to understand. Grayson learned that Vivian's mother had died when she was 4, that she had no memory of her, just fragments and impressions, that her father had never spoken about his wife after the funeral, that Vivian had grown up in a house full of expensive things but empty of love. They were 2 broken people finding unexpected comfort in each other's company, and neither of them noticed the security camera in the hallway, or the report that was being compiled, or the trap that was being set. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after their first Thursday night conversation, Grayson received a phone call. He was in his studio apartment trying to catch a few hours of sleep before his evening shift. The caller ID showed a number he did not recognize, and his first instinct was to ignore it. But something made him answer. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. A woman from Human Resources at Ashford Grand Hotel. She said there was a matter that required his immediate attention. She said he needed to come to the corporate office that afternoon. She said it was regarding his continued employment. Before Grayson could ask any questions, she hung up. He sat on the edge of his bed, the phone still in his hand, his mind racing through possibilities. Had someone complained about his work? Had he made a mistake he was not aware of? Or was this about something else entirely, about the Thursday nights in the penthouse suite, about the hours spent talking to the owner of the company? Grayson's stomach tightened. He had known this was a risk. He had known that getting involved with Vivian, even as just a friend, could cost him everything. But he had done it anyway, because she had needed someone, because he had recognized the loneliness in her eyes, because sometimes you had to take risks even when you knew the consequences. He arrived at the corporate office at 2 o'clock wearing his only suit, the same navy blue suit he had worn to his wife's funeral, the same suit he had worn to countless custody hearings, the suit that had seen every important moment in his life for the past 3 years. The Human Resources Department was on the 2nd floor in a suite of offices designed to intimidate. Expensive furniture, abstract art on the walls, a receptionist who looked at his suit with barely concealed disdain. Grayson waited for 20 minutes before being called into a conference room. The room was large, dominated by a mahogany table that could seat 20 people. But only 3 people were present. A woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as Patricia Hendricks from Human Resources. A man in an expensive navy blazer who did not introduce himself at all. And Preston Whitmore. Grayson recognized him immediately. Silver hair, cold blue eyes, the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. The meeting was brief and brutal. Patricia Hendricks laid out the accusations in a flat, emotionless voice. Security footage showed Grayson entering Vivian Ashford's suite on multiple occasions over the past 3 weeks. He had spent hours in her private quarters during times when he should have been performing his cleaning duties. This represented a serious violation of company policy regarding fraternization between staff and management. Furthermore, there were questions about the nature of his relationship with Miss Ashford. Questions that reflected poorly on both parties. Questions that could expose the company to legal liability. Grayson listened in silence. He knew what was happening. This was not about company policy. This was about leverage. Preston Whitmore wanted to use him as a weapon against Vivian, to paint her as unstable, to suggest that she was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, to give the board another reason to remove her from leadership. Grayson was just a pawn in a game he had never agreed to play. When Patricia finished her recitation, Preston Whitmore spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth and measured, the voice of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He said that under normal circumstances, Grayson would be terminated immediately, but he was prepared to be generous. If Grayson signed a statement confirming the inappropriate nature of his relationship with Vivian, he would be allowed to resign quietly with a neutral reference. If he refused, he would be fired for cause his termination documented in ways that would make it impossible for him to find another job in the hospitality industry. And that documentation would be shared with the court handling his custody case. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Sign the statement or lose any chance of getting his son back. Grayson felt something cold settle in his chest. He looked at Preston Whitmore. At the smug certainty in those pale blue eyes. At the assumption that everyone had a price. And he remembered the night he had turned down $20 billion. He opened his mouth to refuse. But before he could speak, the conference room door burst open. Vivian Ashford stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a severe black suit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to light up the room. She had clearly come straight from another meeting. Her heels clicked against the floor like gunshots as she strode into the room. Patricia Hendricks started to object, but Vivian silenced her with a look. Then she turned to Preston Whitmore, and she spoke. Her voice was calm, controlled, deadly. She said she knew exactly what was happening in this room. She said she had known for days that Preston was planning to use Grayson against her. She said she had let the meeting proceed because she wanted to see just how low her father's former partner was willing to sink. And now she had her answer. Preston Whitmore's smile flickered. Just for a moment. Just enough to show that he had not expected this. Vivian continued. She said that Grayson Mercer was one of the finest employees in the entire Ashford organization. 3 years of perfect performance reviews. 3 years of never missing a shift. 3 years of exemplary service that reflected the values the company claimed to represent. And yes, she had spent time with him. They had talked about life, about struggles, about what it meant to fight for something you believed in. There was nothing inappropriate about those conversations. Nothing that violated any policy. Nothing that anyone with a shred of human decency would question. She turned to look at Grayson, and in that moment he saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not gratitude, not obligation, something deeper. Something that made his heart skip a beat. Vivian turned back to Preston. She said that if anyone tried to terminate Grayson Mercer for the crime of having a conversation with the company's owner, she would personally ensure that every news outlet in the country knew about it. She would expose Preston's scheme, his manipulation of the legal firms, his plans to profit from the company's destruction. Every dirty secret she had uncovered over the past 3 weeks. The choice was simple. Leave Grayson alone, or go to war. Preston Whitmore's face went white, then red, then settled into a mask of cold rage. He stood slowly buttoning his blazer with deliberate care. He said that Vivian was making a mistake. He said that she was letting emotion cloud her judgment. He said that she would regret this moment. Then he walked out of the room. Patricia Hendricks followed him without a word, leaving Grayson and Vivian alone in the conference room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vivian let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. Her shoulders sagged. Her hands trembled slightly. The fierce warrior who had faced down Preston Whitmore was gone. In her place was a young woman who had just put everything on the line for someone she barely knew. Grayson found his voice. He asked her why she had done it, why she had risked so much for him. Vivian looked at him, and she said something that he would never forget. She said that 3 weeks ago he had shown her what courage looked like. He had refused $20 billion because it conflicted with his values. He had treated her like a human being when everyone else saw only dollar signs. He had given her something more valuable than all the money in the world. He had given her hope, and now it was her turn to fight for him. Because that was what friends did. They fought for each other. Grayson felt something break open inside him. Something that had been locked away since his wife's death. Something that he had thought he would never feel again. He did not have words for it. Not yet, so he simply nodded and said thank you. Vivian smiled. It was a small smile, tired, uncertain, but real. She said they should probably get out of this building before Preston did something else stupid. Grayson agreed. They walked out of the corporate office together, not touching, not speaking, but connected in a way that neither of them fully understood. And neither of them knew that Preston Whitmore was already on the phone, making a call to the Sullivan family. Grayson's former in-laws, the people who had custody of his son, offering them something they could not refuse: full legal and financial support for a permanent custody ruling, enough money to fight Grayson in court for as long as it took. In exchange for one thing, their testimony that Grayson Mercer was an unfit father, involved in an inappropriate relationship with a woman of questionable character, unable to provide a stable environment for a 7-year-old boy. The call lasted 15 minutes. By the end of it, Preston Whitmore had new allies in his war against Vivian Ashford, and Grayson Mercer was about to lose the only thing that really mattered to him: his son. The letter from the court arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Grayson stood in the doorway of his studio apartment, the envelope trembling in his hands. He did not need to open it to know what it contained. The return address told him everything. Family Court of Cook County, the same court that had taken his son away 3 years ago. The same court that held his future in its cold, indifferent hands. He opened it anyway. The words blurred before his eyes. Emergency custody hearing. Petition for permanent guardianship. New evidence regarding the father's fitness. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks to prepare a defense against whatever lies Preston Whitmore had helped the Sullivans construct. 3 weeks to fight for the only thing that truly mattered. Grayson sank onto the edge of his bed, the letter crumpling in his fist. He had known this was coming. From the moment Vivian had stood up for him in that conference room, he had known that Preston would find another way to strike. The man was a predator, patient and relentless. If he could not destroy Grayson directly, he would destroy him through his son. And it was working. Grayson thought about Liam, about the boy's smile so like his mother's, about the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, about the basketball trophy photo that Grayson kept on his bedside table, the only image he had of his son from the past year. He thought about losing him forever. And for the first time since his wife's death, Grayson Mercer felt truly hopeless. The phone call came that evening. Vivian's voice was different, urgent, almost breathless. She said she needed to see him. Not at the hotel, somewhere else, somewhere private. She gave him an address on the outskirts of the city, a storage facility where her mother's belongings had been kept for 20 years. She said she had found something that changed everything. Grayson did not ask questions. He climbed onto his Harley-Davidson and rode through the Chicago twilight, the wind cold against his face, his mind churning with possibilities. The storage facility was a gray concrete building in an industrial district surrounded by chain-link fences and security cameras. Vivian was waiting for him at the entrance, her car parked nearby, her face pale in the fading light. She led him inside without speaking, through corridors lined with numbered doors, past units filled with forgotten furniture and dusty boxes, until they reached a unit at the far end of the building. The door was already open. Inside, the space was filled with the artifacts of a life cut short. Vivian's mother had died when she was 4. These were her things. Boxes of clothing that still carried the faint scent of jasmine perfume. Photo albums with pages all yellowed by time. A jewelry box with a broken clasp. A collection of vinyl records from the 70s. And something else. A large cardboard box recently opened, its contents spread across a folding table. Vivian stood beside the table, her hands pressed flat against its surface, her eyes fixed on something Grayson could not see. She spoke without looking up. She said she had been going through her mother's things, looking for something, anything, that might help her understand who she was, who she had been before her father had shaped her into his image. And she had found this. She picked up a photograph and held it out to him. The image was old, faded, the colors washed out by 2 decades of storage. But the subjects were clear enough. 2 children, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing beside a motorcycle. A blue Harley-Davidson chrome gleaming in summer sunlight. The girl was blonde, wearing a yellow sundress, her smile wide and unguarded. The boy was dark-haired, skinny, with a gap-toothed grin and oil stains on his fingers. They were holding hands. Grayson stared at the photograph, his breath caught in his throat. He knew that motorcycle. He knew it because he had spent 3 years of his life restoring it. He knew it because it was parked outside this building right now. And he knew that boy. Because that boy was him. The memories came flooding back like a dam breaking. Riverside, a small town 2 hours north of Chicago, his childhood home. And next door, the summer house where a wealthy family from the city would stay for 3 months every year. A family with a daughter his age, A blonde girl who asked a million questions, who wanted to know everything about motorcycles and engines and how things worked, who followed him around like a shadow, never complaining, never demanding, just happy to be included, who had been his first real friend. Celeste. No, not Celeste. That had been her middle name. The name she had asked him to use because she hated her first name. Her real name was Vivian. Vivian Ashford, the girl standing in front of him now. Grayson looked up from the photograph. Vivian was watching him, tears streaming down her face. She said she had not remembered. 20 years had buried those summers so deep that she had forgotten they ever happened. Her father had sold the summer house when she was 8, right after her mother died. He had erased every trace of those happy times, as if by destroying the evidence, he could destroy the memories themselves. But the photographs had survived, hidden in her mother's things, waiting to be found. She said she remembered now. The boy who had taught her about engines, who had let her help wash his father's motorcycle, who had shown her what freedom felt like for the first time in her life. For her father had started controlling everything, before she had learned to be afraid, before she had forgotten how to be happy. That boy had been Grayson, and the motorcycle he had taught her to love was the same one sitting in his garage today. The one his father had received as a gift when the summer house was sold. The one Grayson had spent 3 years restoring in memory of his dad. The connection had been there all along, waiting for them to see it. Grayson set down the photograph. He looked at Vivian, really looked at her, and suddenly he could see it. The ghost of that little girl in the yellow sundress, the curiosity in her eyes, the hunger for something real. She had been there all along, hidden beneath the armor she had built to survive her father's world. He spoke her name, her real name, the one he had not used in 20 years. Little Celeste, he said, who asked a million questions. Vivian laughed through her tears, a broken sound, a beautiful sound. She said she could not believe it. That of all the people in the world, he was the one she had offered $20 billion. That of all the hotels in Chicago, he was working at hers. That of all the nights in her life, he was the one who had stepped off that elevator. It was impossible. It was ridiculous. It was fate. Grayson moved toward her, not thinking, not planning, just moving. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough to see the tears on her cheeks, close enough to smell the jasmine perfume she wore. Her mother's perfume, he realized. She must have found it in the boxes. He told her about the letter from the court, about the custody hearing, about Preston's alliance with the Sullivans, about the very real possibility that he was about to lose his son forever. Vivian listened in silence. Her tears dried. Her expression hardened. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by the steel that had faced down Preston Whitmore in that conference room. She said they would fight this, together. She said she had resources, lawyers, investigators, the ability to expose Preston's manipulation for what it was. Grayson shook his head. He said this was his fight, not hers. He had already dragged her into enough trouble. He would not let her sacrifice anything more for him. Vivian stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his. And she said something that stopped his heart. She said it was too late for that. She said she was already involved, not because of obligation, not because of guilt, but because somewhere in the past few weeks, without planning it, without expecting it, without even understanding how it had happened, she had started to care about him. Really care. In a way she had never cared about anyone. She said she did not know what to call it. Friendship. Something more. She only knew that when she thought about him losing his son, it felt like her own heart was breaking, and she would not stand by and let that happen. Not when she had the power to help. Grayson was quiet for a long moment. The storage unit hummed with silence. Outside, the Chicago night pressed against the walls, vast and indifferent. And in that small space, surrounded by the remnants of a dead woman's life, two people stood on the edge of something neither of them had anticipated. Grayson spoke slowly, carefully. He said he had been thinking about her situation, about the deadline, about the marriage requirement that was still hanging over her head like a sword. Her legal challenges were progressing, but Margaret had been honest about the timeline. The injunction hearing was still weeks away. There was no guarantee it would succeed, and even if it did, the full challenge could take a year or more to resolve. Meanwhile, her 25th birthday was approaching, 3 weeks away. The same day as his custody hearing, the same day that both their futures would be decided. Vivian said she had made peace with it. If she lost the company, she lost it. She would find another way, build something new. She was not afraid anymore. Grayson shook his head. He said she should not have to lose anything, not when there was another option. Vivian frowned. She asked what he meant. And Grayson Mercer, the man who had refused $20 billion, said the words that would change both their lives. He asked her to marry him. Vivian went still, completely still, as if she had been turned to stone. Grayson continued. He said this was not about money, not a transaction, not a business arrangement. He said he did not know what they had. This connection that seemed to have been waiting for them across 20 years. This feeling that grew stronger every time they talked. This sense that somehow impossibly they belonged together. But he wanted to find out. He wanted to see if it was real. And if getting married would save her company and give them a chance to discover the truth, then why not take that chance? They could do it properly. No lies, no pretense. A real marriage entered into with honest intentions and genuine feeling. If it worked, they would stay together, build a life, a family. If it did not, they would divorce after a year. No harm done, no promises broken, but at least they would have tried. At least they would not spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have been. Vivian stared at him. Her lips parted. No sound came out. Grayson waited. He had said what he needed to say. Now it was her turn. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She asked if he understood what he was offering. Marriage to her would mean scrutiny, investigation. Preston would try to prove it was fake. The board would challenge its validity. Every moment of their relationship would be examined under a microscope. Grayson said he understood. Vivian asked about his custody case, about the Sullivans, about the risk that marrying a billionaire might make him look like a fortune hunter. Grayson said he had thought about that, but he had also thought about what kind of example he wanted to set for his son. Did he want Liam to grow up believing that you should hide from love because it might be difficult, that you should let fear dictate your choices, that you should give up on happiness because people might judge you? No. He wanted his son to see a father who fought for what he believed in, who took chances on things that mattered, who loved without reservation and lived without regret, even if it meant losing, even if it meant pain, because that was what courage looked like, and that was the man he wanted to be. Vivian was crying again, but this time the tears were different. Not grief, not fear, something else, something that looked like joy. She said yes. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning, 3 days before Vivian's 25th birthday. There was no grand ceremony, no cathedral filled with flowers, no army of guests in designer gowns and tailored suits, just a simple civil service at the Cook County Courthouse. Dorothy Webb was there looking uncomfortable in her best dress. Maria from Eddie's Diner was there having closed her restaurant for the morning. Margaret Holloway was there, her briefcase at her feet, ready for whatever legal challenges might follow. And Vivian and Grayson were there. She wore her royal blue blazer, the one she had been wearing the night they met, the color of the Harley-Davidson that had connected them across 20 years. He wore his navy blue suit, the one that had seen every important moment in his life. They had arrived together on the motorcycle. Vivian on the back, her arms wrapped around his waist, her hair streaming behind her like a golden flag. When the judge asked if they took each other as husband and wife, they both said yes without hesitation. When they kissed for the first time, it felt like coming home. Preston Whitmore filed his challenge before the ink was dry on the marriage certificate. He claimed the union was fraudulent, a sham designed to circumvent the terms of Harrison Ashford's will. He demanded an investigation, a delay in the inheritance transfer, time to prove that Vivian had simply bought herself a husband. Margaret was ready. She presented the photograph from the storage unit, the evidence of a childhood connection that predated any business arrangement by 20 years. She produced witnesses who had known both families in Riverside, people who remembered the summer house, the blonde girl and the dark-haired boy, the friendship that had been interrupted by tragedy and time. She argued that this was not a marriage of convenience. It was the reunion of two people whose lives had been intertwined since childhood. Two people who had found each other again against impossible odds. Two people who deserved the chance to build a future together. The judge ruled in their favor. The marriage was valid. The inheritance would transfer as scheduled. Preston Whitmore walked out of the courtroom with murder in his eyes. But that was only the first battle. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, the same day as Vivian's 25th birthday, the day she would officially become the owner of the Ashford hotel chain. Two battles on one day, two futures hanging in the balance. The courtroom was different from the one where they had been married. Smaller, more intimate, designed for the painful work of deciding children's futures. The Sullivans sat on one side, flanked by three lawyers whose fees were being paid by Preston Whitmore. Grayson sat on the other side with Margaret and Vivian beside him. And between them, the fate of a 7-year-old boy hung in the balance. The Sullivans' case was straightforward. Grayson was an unstable provider. He had been homeless after his wife's death. He worked 2 jobs, leaving no time for proper parenting. And now he had entered into a suspicious marriage with a billionaire, suggesting that his judgment was compromised by greed. They produced the documents that Preston had helped them compile. Records of Grayson's financial struggles, reports from social workers, testimony from neighbors who had seen him coming and going at odd hours. A picture of a man who could not possibly provide a stable home for a child. Then it was Grayson's turn. Margaret presented his case with surgical precision. 3 years of perfect employment records, evidence of consistent child support payments, documentation of his BlackRock evaluation proving his financial prospects were improving. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Vivian Ashford Mercer took the stand. She did not speak as a billionaire. She did not speak as the owner of a hotel empire. She spoke as a woman who had watched Grayson work through the night every night for 3 years, who had seen him sacrifice sleep and comfort and personal happiness to send every spare dollar to his son, who had listened to him talk about Liam with a love so deep and pure that it made her believe in things she had thought were impossible. She told the court about the night they had met, about the $20 billion he had refused, about the principle and dignity he had shown when anyone else would have taken the money and run. She said that in her entire life, she had never met a man with more integrity than Grayson Mercer, and she believed with all her heart that he deserved to raise his son. The Sullivans' lawyer tried to paint her testimony as biased. Of course she would defend her husband, he said. She had a financial interest in making him look good. But Vivian shut him down with a single sentence. She said she had offered Grayson more money than the Sullivans would see in 1,000 lifetimes. And he had said no, because his principles were worth more than her fortune. What did that tell the court about his character? The lawyer had no response. And then Margaret played her final card. She called for a recess. When the court reconvened, she introduced new evidence. Evidence that had been obtained just 2 days earlier through an investigation Vivian had commissioned into Preston Whitmore's activities. The evidence showed that Grayson's delay from BlackRock had not been administrative. It had been deliberate. Preston Whitmore had contacted the firm and suggested that they reconsider their acceptance of Grayson Mercer. He had implied that Grayson was involved in a scandal at Ashford Hotels, that he was about to be terminated for misconduct, that associating with him could damage BlackRock's reputation. The delay had been Preston's doing, a deliberate attempt to sabotage Grayson's financial prospects and weaken his custody case. Margaret presented phone records, emails, a recorded conversation between Preston and a BlackRock executive. The evidence was irrefutable. The Sullivans' lawyer objected. He claimed the evidence was irrelevant to the custody question, but the judge disagreed. The judge said that any evidence of coordinated efforts to harm the father's prospects was absolutely relevant, and he wanted to know more about the relationship between Preston Whitmore and the Sullivans. Under questioning, the truth came out. Preston had approached the Sullivans 3 weeks ago. He had offered to pay their legal fees. He had promised them resources to fight for permanent custody. In exchange, they had agreed to testify that Grayson was unfit, to emphasize his financial struggles, to paint the darkest possible picture of his circumstances. They had been pawns, just like Grayson had almost been. Pieces in Preston Whitmore's game against Vivian Ashford. The judge's expression hardened. He said that using a child custody case as a weapon in a corporate battle was unconscionable. He said he had seen many things in his years on the bench, but rarely something this calculated. And he said that he would be referring the matter to the district attorney for investigation. The ruling came 3 hours later, joint custody, effective immediately, Liam Mercer would spend equal time with his father and his grandparents, and within 6 months, pending successful completion of the transition, primary custody would transfer to Grayson. When Grayson heard the words, he broke down. The quiet man who had refused $20 billion without flinching. The dignified janitor who had pushed his cleaning cart through empty hallways without complaint. The fighter who had never given up, no matter how hard life hit him. He sat in that courtroom and wept. Vivian held his hand. She did not speak. She did not need to. She just held on and let him feel for the first time in 3 years that he was not alone. The final revelation came 2 weeks later. Margaret had continued her investigation into Preston Whitmore's activities, convinced that there was more to uncover. She was right. Deep in the files of Harrison Ashford's estate, buried under layers of corporate documents and legal filings, she found a letter. A letter written by Harrison Ashford 3 days before his death. A letter that Preston Whitmore had hidden from everyone. Margaret brought it to Vivian on a rainy evening. They sat together in the penthouse suite. The document between them, and Vivian read her father's final words. The letter was addressed to her. "My dear Vivian," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the terms of my will have caused you pain. I need you to understand why I wrote them, and why I hope you will forgive me. I was never good at being a father. After your mother died, something in me broke. I poured all of my love, all of my energy into the company, because it was easier than facing the grief. I told myself I was building something for you, but the truth is I was hiding from you. I wrote the marriage requirement because I was afraid. Afraid that I had failed you. Afraid that you would make the same mistakes I made, sacrificing love for success, ending up alone with nothing but money and regret. I wanted you to find what I never could. A partner, a family, a reason to live beyond the next quarterly report. But I was wrong to try to force it. Love cannot be compelled. Marriage cannot be mandated. I see that now in these final days when everything becomes clear. If you are reading this, you have probably found your own way. You have probably fought against my control just as you should have. You are stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I want you to know that I am proud of you, not for the degrees you earned or the deals you closed, but for the woman you have become despite everything I did wrong. I love you, Vivian. I always have. I just never knew how to show it. Please forgive me. Your father." Vivian read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down. And she cried. Not tears of grief, not tears of anger, tears of release. 24 years of wondering if her father had ever loved her. 24 years of feeling like a disappointment. 24 years of believing she was nothing more than an asset to be managed. And now, finally, the truth. He had loved her. In his broken, inadequate way, he had loved her. Margaret used the letter to accelerate the legal challenge. Combined with the evidence of Preston's manipulation, it painted a clear picture of fraud and undue influence. The will was declared invalid. The marriage requirement was struck down. Vivian was awarded full control of the Ashford hotel chain, free of any conditions. Preston Whitmore was removed from the board of directors. 6 months later, he was indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. He would spend the next several years in a federal prison with plenty of time to reflect on what his schemes had cost him. 6 months after the custody ruling, Liam Mercer moved in with his father. The transition had been gradual, careful, designed to minimize disruption to the boy's life. But from the first night in his new room, Liam seemed to understand that he was finally home. Grayson had kept his BlackRock position, trading successfully while building his reputation in the financial world. But he had also started something else. A small motorcycle restoration shop in a converted warehouse on the south side of Chicago. He called it Second Chance Cycles. The sign above the door showed a blue Harley-Davidson, the same one that sat in his garage. The same one that had connected him to Vivian across 20 years. Young people came from all over the city to learn from him. Kids who had been told they would never amount to anything. Kids who needed someone to believe in them. Kids who reminded Grayson of himself. He taught them about engines and gears, about the satisfaction of working with your hands, about the pride of transforming something broken into something beautiful. And Vivian was there, not every day. Running an $18 billion hotel chain did not leave much free time, but she came whenever she could, to watch her husband teach, to see the children's faces light up when something clicked, to remember the little girl in the yellow sundress who had once learned about motorcycles from a boy with oil on his fingers. She had transformed the Ashford hotel chain, renamed it Sterling Grand, combining her mother's maiden name with her grandmother's legacy. She had implemented new policies focused on employee welfare, sustainable practices, and community engagement. The board meetings were different now, filled with people who shared her vision, people who understood that a company could be profitable and principled at the same time, people who saw hospitality as service, not just business. And every night she came home to a house that was nothing like the cold mansion of her childhood, a house filled with warmth and laughter and love. A house where Liam's basketball trophies shared shelf space with Grayson's trading awards, where the smell of home-cooked meals replaced the sterile perfection of professional catering, where a family had been built, not bought. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Grayson surprised Vivian with a gift. He led her to the garage where the blue Harley-Davidson waited. But something was different. On the fuel tank beneath the restored chrome, a new engraving had been added. Two children holding hands, a boy and a girl, underneath a single line. Some things are worth waiting 20 years for. Vivian traced the engraving with her fingers. She did not speak. She did not need to. She just wrapped her arms around her husband and held on. Behind them, Liam appeared in the doorway, 8 years old now, growing fast, looking more like his mother every day. But with his father's quiet strength, his father's gentle soul, his father's belief that some things were worth more than money. He asked if they were going for a ride. Grayson smiled. He said yes, all three of them. They climbed onto the motorcycle Liam squeezed between his parents, his small arms wrapped around his father's waist, and they rode out into the Chicago sunset. A family forged by fate, tested by fire, bound by something stronger than blood or money, bound by choice. The choice to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. The choice to believe when belief seemed foolish. The choice to love when love seemed impossible. In the end, that was what separated them from everyone else. Not wealth, not power, not the empires they controlled or the deals they closed. Just the simple, profound choice to be there for each other. Through everything, no matter what. Some things in life cannot be bought. They can only be chosen. And those are the things that matter most.